In the southeastern corner of Arizona, the Sulphur Springs Valley opens across a wide stretch of desert grassland and alkaline flatlands. Every winter, something happens here that stops people cold. Just before sunrise, the water sitting on the valley floor is flat and gray, only a few inches deep. It covers an ancient lake bed that spends most of the year as cracked white ground, hard and salt-crusted and empty. Then tens of thousands of sandhill cranes lift off the surface at once. These are large birds, wingspans approaching 6 feet, some of them weighing 14 pounds. Right now, there are nearly 35,000 of them in the air above a few inches of shallow water on a dry salt flat in the Arizona desert. The sound carries for miles across the basin. For one brief window at dawn, the sky is nothing but wings. It looks exactly the way untouched nature is supposed to look. Self-governing, unhurried, completely beyond the reach of anything human. Not a single crane in that sky is there by accident. All of it, every bird and every ripple crossing the flat before sunrise, exists because of a deliberate, engineered decision made by a small state wildlife agency operating on what amounts to a tight real estate budget. The principle behind that decision is not a wildlife conservation principle. It is a wealth creation principle, one that most people currently renting in the United States have never encountered, even though it has been quietly transforming dismissed, neglected, worthless land into productive, high-return assets for the better part of a century. This is the story of what happened in this valley. How a dead alkaline flat became one of the most important bird sites in the American Southwest. And why the same logic, applied at the same modest scale, is the thing that separates people who are quietly building real financial stability from the ground up from everyone else who accepted the idea that worthless is permanent. It starts with 6 inches of water. It ends with a question you're going to want to sit with for a while. Just before sunrise, the Sulphur Springs Valley in southeastern Arizona is almost completely silent. The water on the valley floor is flat and gray, only a few inches deep, stretched across an old alkaline lake bed that spends most of the year as cracked white ground. Hard, pale, salt-crusted, and worth stopping for by absolutely no one. Then it begins. A low, rolling sound builds across the shallows. First 1 crane, then 100, then what sounds like the entire sky at once. Tens of thousands of sandhill cranes lift off the water in a single, continuous surge of wings. These are not small birds. Wingspans approaching 6 feet. Some of them weigh 14 pounds. And right now there are nearly 35,000 of them in the air above a few inches of water on a dry Arizona salt flat. It is one of the most spectacular wildlife events on this continent. None of it is natural. The water isn't natural. The crane's presence here isn't. The roosting site that pulls them back to this specific valley year after year, in numbers that have multiplied by nearly 9 times, is entirely manufactured. Every element of what you're seeing exists because someone decided to make it exist. And they did it on a budget that most people reading about real estate investing would recognize immediately. The question is, what exactly did they do? And why, once you understand it, does the answer change the way you see every neglected, forgotten piece of land you've ever driven past? Because it does. It will. But to understand why 6 inches of water could do any of this, you need to see what this place looked like before anyone decided to try, and why every person who had looked at it before reached the same, very confident, very wrong conclusion. The Wilcox Playa is, by most visible definitions, not a particularly impressive piece of geography. It is the dry floor of an ancient lake. A closed basin, meaning no river flows out of it. Whatever water manages to reach the flat has exactly one direction it can travel. Straight up, through evaporation, under the Arizona desert sun. That process, running continuously for thousands of years, has been doing the same thing to this soil that seal time does to anything left to concentrate. Pulling the salts and minerals out, depositing them on the surface until the ground hardens into that pale, alkaline crust you can see stretching away from the highway. A Pleistocene lake bed, older than anything built in this country, and for most practical purposes, dead. If you had driven past it 70 years ago, you would have seen white emptiness and kept moving. Part of the playa had been used as a military bombing range. A large section of it still sits today behind federal no trespassing signs, owned by the Department of Defense, left essentially unmanaged. In this landscape, that means exposed to desert heat, illegal dumping, and the slow accumulation of nothing. The kind of ground a real estate investor drives past without slowing down. Worthless by every visible metric. And here is the thing about that word, worthless, that this story is going to take apart piece by piece. Worthless is almost never a permanent condition. It is a conditional one. It describes what a place cannot do given its current conditions. It says absolutely nothing about what that place would do if one specific condition changed. The Wilcox Playa looked like the end of something. It was actually the waiting room before a beginning, and the only thing separating those two states was a question that almost nobody thought to ask. Most people, when they see land like this, reach the obvious conclusion and keep driving. The Arizona Game and Fish Department asked the follow-up question. But before we get to what they found, there is one more layer to how the cranes arrived in this valley in the first place. It wasn't planning. It wasn't a government program. It wasn't anything intentional at all. It was corn. By the late 1940s, settlers in the Sulphur Springs Valley had reached the groundwater sitting beneath the high desert basin and started pulling it to the surface. Corn spread across the valley floor, field after field of it, irrigated rows running across ground that had previously grown close to nothing. And every harvest, the way harvests do, left waste grain scattered behind it. Spillage and byproduct, calories sitting in the dirt with nowhere to go. Sandhill cranes migrating south each winter from the Rocky Mountains found that grain and started stopping here on their way through. Here is the part of that sentence that matters most, and it is easy to miss. Cranes pass habits down. The birds that discovered the Sulphur Springs Valley didn't just eat and leave. They taught the next generation of their family where the food was, and those birds taught theirs. Over seasons, over decades, the valley earned a permanent place on the crane migration map. Not because anyone planned it, but because an accidental food source created an accidental tradition. What researchers found when they looked at the biology of this situation is that the corn could only do half the job. Sandhill cranes don't roost in trees. They can't. They sleep standing in shallow, open water, specifically because water acts as an early warning system against predators. A coyote wading toward a sleeping flock creates ripples and sound long before it can arrive. The birds are airborne before the threat reaches them. Remove the water and you've removed the alarm system. You've given a flock of large, slow-breeding, ground-level birds no protection overnight in a desert full of things that eat large birds. Without standing water, this valley was a daytime cafeteria with no safe bedroom. The cranes could feed here. They couldn't safely sleep here. And in a desert southwest that was already becoming unreliable for rainfall, the seasonal pools that might have served as overnight roosting water were disappearing during dry years with increasing frequency. The whole arrangement sat balanced on weather patterns that were getting harder to count on. A single fragile input sustaining a growing tradition, and not much underneath it if that input failed. Before we get to what changed this, have you ever looked at a piece of land or a property and immediately written it off? Something you drove past and dismissed without ever asking what it was actually missing? Drop it in the comments, because what comes next is going to make you look at that memory differently. That situation the cranes were in, enough food but no shelter, the entire presence dependent on one unreliable input, is the exact risk profile of any investment that depends on a single driver of value. One driver is always fragile. That is the lesson the cornfield was teaching, even though nobody was listening yet. This is where the Arizona Game and Fish Department changed the outcome. The solution, when you see it clearly, is almost frustratingly simple. In 1997, Arizona Game and Fish purchased a former cattle ranch in the Sulphur Springs Valley, worn-out high desert pasture and farmland that nobody else was bidding on. They began converting it into a managed wetland. Crews recontoured the land, raised earthen levees, and installed water control structures. The goal was not to create a lake or restore some imagined pristine ecology. It was just to hold water. Specifically, to hold 6 inches of it across a section of the flat, consistently, through the winter months when the cranes needed it. 6 inches. You could wade across that in your street shoes without getting your knees wet. Sections were set up as what managers call moist soil cells, areas that could be flooded through the winter and drawn down later to grow exactly the plants and invertebrates that water birds feed on. Every levee and culvert was another small decision in favor of keeping the water where the birds needed it. The total investment across the major restoration phase ran to roughly $240,000, including a $50,000 federal wetlands conservation grant under the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, with additional partnership from Ducks Unlimited. Not a trivial sum, but well within the range of a serious residential real estate project. The kind of number that gets spent routinely on a kitchen renovation in a suburban flip. A January survey at Whitewater Draw Wildlife Area in 1991 found approximately 4,000 sandhill cranes. That was the starting line. What happened next is the turn almost nobody outside the valley saw coming. By 2008, that same site held more than 22,000 cranes. Another 13,000 were counted at the Wilcox Playa, 36 miles to the north. The numbers didn't creep upward by a few birds a year. They climbed season after season as the managed water became something the cranes could rely on, and reliable water in a dry region is rare enough to pull birds in from across the entire flyway. The flooding didn't just keep local birds alive. It made this one valley a magnet for a population spread across half a continent. 4,000 birds to better than 30,000 across the valley in a single human generation. In a place that cannot reliably hold a puddle on its own. But the cranes were only the beginning of what 6 inches of water actually built. When the flat floods, the alkaline pools wake up. Brine shrimp and alkali fly larvae. An invertebrate bloom that fills standing water with working food almost overnight. That bloom feeds shorebirds and waterfowl that have nothing to do with the corn in the fields. Snow geese, 15,000 ducks in peak seasons. Avocets, stilts, white-faced ibis, and raptors, including bald and golden eagles drawn in by the sheer density of prey. The shallow water built to protect cranes ended up growing an entire food web underneath them. And around the wet margins lives something far less famous than the cranes. The plains leopard frog. One of the most narrowly distributed amphibians in all of Arizona. The population at Whitewater Draw is now the healthiest and most stable of any known in the state. A species barely surviving across the rest of Arizona, thriving in a marsh that exists only because someone keeps refilling it by hand. By 2008, Whitewater Draw had been recognized as an important bird area. By 2011, it had earned global IBA status, a threshold requiring 20,000 or more water birds at a single site. The cranes get the cameras and the festival and the headline numbers. The same 6 inches of water is quietly carrying species that would otherwise have nowhere left to go. If this framing is landing, the idea that identifying what a neglected asset actually needs is the real skill and not just the capital, hit the like button right now. It helps more people find this video. This next part is the one most people never hear, because the story usually stops here. Except there's a problem. The same problem every great low-cost, high-return play eventually runs into. The version of the story you usually hear stops at the beautiful part. The dawn flights, the record crane counts, the trumpeting that washes over the marsh at sunrise. That version calls it a conservation success story and ends there. The fuller picture is more complicated. When you concentrate 35,000 birds onto a small number of artificial roost sites, you have done something brilliant and something structurally dangerous at the same time. A single catastrophic season at those sites, whether it's a deep drought, a water rights dispute, or a fire on the dry flat, reaches a disproportionate share of the entire regional crane population simultaneously. And sandhill cranes, biologically, cannot recover quickly from a hit like that. A pair won't even attempt to nest until it's 4 or 5 years old. Most successful nests produce exactly one chick. A population built over decades of consistent habitat support cannot simply refill itself if a series of bad winters in Arizona scatters the flock. The climate threat is real and it is tightening. Drought deepening across the southwest is shrinking the seasonal water availability the whole system depends on. The groundwater beneath this valley has been pumped hard for agriculture for 70 years. The managers are running a marsh against the grain of the entire region's hydrology. And the gap between what the desert wants to do and what the cranes need keeps getting wider every dry year. The agricultural dependency adds another layer. The cranes spend every single morning in the surrounding corn, alfalfa, and milo fields, feeding on waste grain and probing the stubble. They fly out at first light, spend the morning in the fields, and return to the safe water by late afternoon. The roost and the farmland operate as a single machine, and neither half works without the other. If farming changes in this valley, if water rights shift, if fields go fallow as agriculture retreats from a drying landscape, the feeding half of the crane's world could vanish even while the roost stays wet. The largest stretch of the Wilcox Playa is still sitting behind federal no trespassing signs, exposed to illegal dumping and fire risk, with no agency actively caring for it. The thriving part of the valley is precisely the part somebody chose to maintain. The rest is the desert doing what the desert has always done, which is very little. So think about this for a second. A spectacular result, achieved through a minimum viable intervention on an asset nobody wanted. Now threatened by the exact forces that make the underlying environment difficult in the first place. The success created new vulnerability. The concentration that made the spectacle possible also made it brittle. You've heard this story before. Maybe you heard it about a property or a neighborhood, or a market that shifted underneath someone who thought the hard part was done once the asset started performing. The thriving part is always precisely the part somebody chose to keep working on. That is the whole principle. And here is what it looks like without the nature documentary framing. Someone looked at a piece of land that every person before them had driven past. A former cattle ranch on a dead alkaline flat. 0 bidders. No obvious value. White, cracked, worth stopping for by absolutely no one. They identified the single input this land was missing, one specific thing: reliable shallow water at 6 inches of depth through the winter months. They applied that input consistently on a managed schedule. They maintained it. Year after year, the same decision made again. Keep the water coming. The result was a population multiplication of nearly 9 times. A regional tourism economy built downstream of that single decision. A wildlife corridor now sustaining 2 distinct crane populations across the interior Southwest. A boardwalk, a festival. A 1-mile loop through Cattail Marsh to viewing platforms where people stand in the cold before dawn to watch something that would not exist without a pump and a plan. A frog population thriving in the one corner of Arizona that chose to maintain the conditions it needed. Now here is the same principle in the language most of us actually need it in. There are properties sitting right now in forgotten agricultural corridors, in rural patches of the Southwest and the Rust Belt and the hollowed-out towns of the industrial Midwest, sitting in exactly the condition the Wilcox Playa sat in before 1997. Cracked and empty and dismissed. And the assumption everyone makes when they drive past that worthless is permanent is doing the same work in their financial lives that it did in this valley before someone asked the second question. The second question is not, is this land worth anything? That is always the wrong question. It treats worth as a fixed property of the land itself, and worth is not fixed. Worth is conditional. It describes what a place cannot do given its current conditions. And conditions are changeable, sometimes by very small, very deliberate interventions. The right question is, what is the single minimum intervention that changes the conditions? What is this asset's 6 inches of water? Because once you identify that, once you find the one precise input this neglected thing has been missing, everything that follows is the compounding effect of a decision made consistently. The land itself doesn't change. The only thing that changes is what you choose to add to it, and whether you keep adding it. Sandhill cranes have been on this earth for nearly 2 million years. They predate our entire financial system by a margin that makes the stock market look like a fairly new idea. And they nearly disappeared from this valley because nobody decided that 6 inches of water was worth maintaining. The most spectacular bird gathering in Arizona rests on annual water deliveries, a power company's wetlands, and the leftovers from a corn field. It looks like the wildest, most untouched thing in the world. That is the quiet irony at the center of it. So here is what you take away from 35,000 cranes lifting off a dry salt flat at dawn. A diagnostic framework, not a nature lesson. When you encounter an asset that everyone around you has written off, and you will if you haven't already, 3 questions determine whether you walk past it or change its conditions permanently. First, what single input is this asset missing? One thing, not 10. The thing that, if present, would change what this place is capable of being. In the Sulphur Springs Valley, the answer was 6 inches of reliable water through the winter. In a neglected urban parcel, it might be consistent maintenance and a single permitted use that nobody ever pursued. In a rural property, it might be a water connection, a road easement, or a zoning clarification that previous owners never bothered to seek. In a distressed residential property, it might be the one structural repair that every buyer before you walked away from rather than face. Second, what is the minimum viable version of that input? The version that changes the condition with the least possible intervention, not the one that requires outside capital or a complicated partnership or years of planning. Arizona Game and Fish did not rebuild the Southwest's hydrology. They moved water to a depth of 6 inches across land they already controlled. Third, and this is the one most people skip entirely, can you maintain that input consistently? Year after year, the same decision, keep the water coming. This is where most small real estate plays fail, not in the acquisition and not in the initial intervention, but in the maintenance. In the decision that has to be made again when it becomes inconvenient. The Whitewater Draw story is not a story about a single good decision. It is a story about the same good decision made every winter for nearly 3 decades. Most people who feel trapped in the renting cycle are not there because they lack capital. The amounts required to acquire the correctly identified asset are often smaller than a single year's rent. They are there because they accepted the worthless is permanent conclusion before they ever asked what 6 inches of water would do. The people who quietly built financial stability from assets that everyone else drove past were not smarter and they were not luckier. They asked the second question first. What does this place need? And what happens if I'm the one who provides it? The dawn liftoff at Whitewater Draw still looks like the wildest, most untouched thing in the world. That is exactly the point. And it is also the warning. The things that look like they maintain themselves are always the things that would disappear the fastest if anyone stopped deciding to maintain them. The spectacle continues because every year, people decide to keep the water coming. Your version of the story is somewhere out there. The question is whether you're going to drive past it or stop and ask what it's missing. The next video takes this framework and applies it to 3 specific property types sitting undervalued across the country right now. The ones that look like dead salt flats from the outside and come with a very different story once you know what to ask. If you want to be there when that drops, hit subscribe. That's the one I don't want you to miss.